Do you understand what relative risk is? I was like, the relative risk is way too low. And this is why. In adequately designed studies, we can be reasonably confident about big relative risks. Sometimes we can only be guardedly confident about relative risks estimates of the order of 2.0. Occasionally, we can hardly ever be confident about estimates of less than 2.0. And when estimates are much below 2.0, we are simply out of business. Epidemiologists have only primitive tools, which for small relative risks are too crude to enable us to distinguish between bias, confounding, and causation.
All right, guys, so this is a video I wanted to do for a while because there are a lot of people who deny epidemiology, and they love to go here. They love to say that a relative risk was too low, even though it was statistically significant and it was a very large, well-controlled study with a massive population size, and it did a great job controlling for confounding factors, but the relative risk just wasn't high enough. And this point gets repeated a lot. So we'll go through the epidemiology, we'll go through what a relative risk is, we'll go through why this is not a hard, fast rule that relative risks need to be above 2.0, and specifically in the context of the vegan debate, why this doesn't apply. Let's start with the basics of a cohort study. The basic formulation of analyzing a cohort study results are as follows. There's an exposed group and a non-exposed group. The exposed group could be an exposure to anything. It could be an exposure to a drug. It could be exposure to a certain environment. It could be exposure to a given food. And then there's a non-exposed group. These two groups are prospectively followed, and a given disease in question can develop or it cannot develop. A represents the total amount of people who were exposed to a given condition and the disease developed. B represents the total number of people who were exposed to a condition and the disease did not develop. C represents the total number of people who were not exposed to a given condition and at the outcome the disease did develop, while D represents the total number of people who were not exposed to a given condition and the disease did not develop. The total number of people in the exposed group is obviously A plus B. The total number of people in the non-exposed group is simply C plus D. And the absolute risk, the risk of developing the disease in an exposed group, is represented by A over A plus B. And the absolute risk of developing the disease in the non-exposed group is simply represented by C over C plus D. So A over A plus B is the absolute risk of developing a given disease for a given exposure, and C over C plus D is the absolute risk of developing a given disease in the non-exposed group. The relative risk, all it is simply the ratio of these two things. It's the ratio of the absolute risk of the exposed group to the absolute risk of the non-exposed group. So it's A over A plus B divided by C over C plus D. That's all a relative risk is. To understand why demanding a relative risk be 2 or greater in every single circumstance across the board is not only silly but mathematically impossible, let's take the following example. Suppose that in the non-exposed group, or the control group, or the prevalence of the general population, however you're framing your cohort study, suppose that the risk is 0.51 or 51%. Suppose that's the absolute risk. So we're dealing with a high prevalence or high incidence disease. So that would mean that in the non-exposed group, that the disease prevalence or the incidence or the ratio of people to the total amount of people who are exposed to the total amount of people would be 51%. Now, if that's the case, how could you possibly ever get a relative risk of 2? If C divided by C plus D is equal to 0.51, how could you possibly manipulate A over A plus B to get to a total relative risk of 2? You can't, because even if the exposed group, even if it was 100%, even if everyone in the exposed group developed the disease, which means B would be 0, so no one who was exposed ever developed the disease. and everyone who was exposed developed the disease, 100% of people, you still don't get to a relative risk of 2. The maximum theoretical possible relative risk is 1.96 in this case. The reason for that is in order to have a relative risk of 2, you would have to be over 100% of an absolute risk to get the disease. So the bottom line here is relative risk needs to be interpreted in the context of disease prevalence. That's the key. Relative risks have caps. They have ceilings. They have theoretical possible maximums for which nothing greater can be possible based on the prevalence or incidence of the reference group, assuming that the group being compared to the reference group has a higher absolute risk than the referent group. So for example, if the prevalence is greater than 50, assuming the reference group has a risk greater than 50%, it would never be possible to double this, because doubling that would just mean that you would have an absolute risk of greater than 100%. The maximum theoretical possible relative risk can be calculated by taking 100%, dividing it by the percentage of the prevalence in the referent group. So if it's 10, for example, it will be 100 divided by 10, which would give you 10. 100 divided by 20, if it's 20%, would give you 5, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll notice in this table that the maximum possible risk ratio is going to drastically decrease as the prevalence of the disease increases. And you'll notice something especially important in the vegan debate is heart disease mortality rates. What's the prevalence of heart disease mortality rates in the general population? It's about 25%. So what's the maximum possible relative risk? The maximum possible relative risk is going to be 4, which is pretty darn low. And so people will criticize a relative risk of 1.3 or 1.4, 1.5. Well, keep in mind that the maximum possible relative risk in this case is going to be just 4.
So Frank, if you find one person who smoked their entire life, they never got cancer, that means smoking doesn't cause cancer?
No, but for something like smoking, the relative risk is exponentially higher. Let's look at the relative risk for smoking.
Yeah, sure, but like the claim you're making is if you find one outlier in a data point, that makes the entire set of data worthless. So if you find
it
one
doesn't,
person,
because the relative risk for smoking is like, it's not 1.1, it's like fucking 70.
okay, so
it's
then
crazy.
The absolute risk for a non-smoker, if we follow them through their life, it's going to be about 100 per 100,000. Now, for someone who smokes 20 cigarettes a day, it's going to be about lifetime risk, somewhere around 1,000 per 100,000. Now, that's a relative risk of 100, right? It's a relative risk of 100, but what's the cap? In this case, the cap's about 1,000. So you're only at 10% of your cap. It's not like the relative risk of heart disease mortality, which, by the way, in the 7-Day Adventist study, the vegan women didn't do that great, but the vegan men, if you look at the vegan men, the relative risk ratio got around 2, and for ischemic heart disease, it was above 2 compared to the reference. It was about 2.2 for ischemic heart disease, and it was about 1.7 for cardiovascular disease mortality. So that's already a greater percentage of your cap ratio, the cap of your relative risk ratio, than in the case of smoking for lung cancer mortality rates. Now, for this comparison, obviously, I'm assuming that we're just looking at these two variables. I'm going to assume meat doesn't cause anything other than cardiovascular disease, and I'm going to assume smoking doesn't cause anything other than lung cancer mortality. Obviously, smoking will cause other problems and may kill the patient before they actually die of lung cancer. So, but the point still stands. You can't make this comparison. You can't compare lung cancer relative risks to relative risk for a disease that is far more prevalent. Look at the absolute change in relative risk. This right here, this relative risk of 100 bumps you up to 1%. That's it. It bumps you up to 1,000 out of 100,000. That's all it does. From 0.1% to 1%. That's all you get. In that case, if you would apply this to, for example, the ischemic heart disease risk of vegan males compared to non-vegan males, compared to omnivore males, would get you 2.2. You would end up getting a greater absolute risk increase in that situation, even though the relative risk would be far lower than 100. So there are cases where low relative risks would actually be more impactful than a relative risk of 100. You have to consider the background disease incidence and disease prevalence. So this is the example I was talking about. This is the male cohort of the Seventh-day Adventist study for ischemic heart disease and cardiovascular disease, right? So for ischemic heart disease, mortality rate in male vegans compared to male omnivores, you get a relative risk of 0.45. If you flip it, 1 divided by 0.45, that's already a relative risk greater than 2. It's 2.2. But let's steelman the carnivore position here, right? Let's say it's just 0.58. Let's say that maps out to all cardiovascular mortality, all heart disease mortality. It would be better described by 0.58. 1 over 0.58, by the way, would be about 1.7. So that would be a relative risk less than 2, flipping the referent. So look at the absolute risk reduction, though, right? Because remember that 25% was the baseline prevalence risk of dying from heart disease. So what's the absolute risk reduction? Well, 25% multiplied by this relative risk by 0.58, it gives you about a relative risk of, it changes your absolute risk to 14.5. So the difference is about 10.5%. So the problem is you can't notice how this wasn't a relative risk. This is not 1 divided by 0.58 is just going to be a relative risk of 1.7. It's not nowhere equivalent to the smoking example where it's a relative risk of 100. But notice that the absolute change in risk, the change in absolute risk is only going to be about 1% in the smoking case. But in this case, it's going to be at least 10%. There is a much greater impact. So there can be a much greater impact with low relative risks than high relative risks if the prevalence of the disease is much higher. Now, Frank quotes Samuel Shapiro, who published this paper in Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety in 2004. And this is basically Samuel Shapiro's view, that for relative risks, he can only count 3 numbers. He can count the number 1, the number 2, and big. But you'll notice, if Frank actually read through the paper instead of just quoting it, that in almost every case, except for one case, the diseases where he's criticizing low relative risks are cases where the absolute risk in the general population is not that great. Breast cancer mortality especially, and the overall incidence of breast cancer is not going to be 25% of the population. Same thing goes for ovarian cancer, and especially a subset type of ovarian cancer. The exception to this are all cancers, and this comes from a paper from calcium channel blockers finding a relative risk of 1.72 for all cancers. Now that does have a large prevalence. Now, risk of getting cancer is something that's going to have a high disease prevalence, right? But if you follow the paper trail from Shapiro's paper, what you'll actually find is that the problem wasn't that the relative risk was 1.72 as opposed to something greater than 2. The overall problem was just that it was a low-powered study. There was only about 5,000 people total, and the follow-up time wasn't that great. They don't give you the mean number of follow-up time, but if you take both groups and you do the math, so you would do, they have 1,549 person years. If you divide that by 451, and similarly, if you take 17,225, you divide that by 4,601. In both of these cases, it's less than 4 years of mean follow-up time per person. I think it's about 3.7. So there's a low follow-up time, and the total sample size is low. It's a study that just wasn't well-powered enough to detect these small differences. And even if they did detect a difference, probably a lot of this may have gone away if they had a greater sample size and a greater follow-up time. Now, the other thing to say about this study is that most of the difference came from one calcium channel blocker in particular. So it's not just saying that all calcium channel blockers are going to be associated with cancer. There was one calcium channel blocker that really stood out, which was verapamil. Now, some other studies have found similar findings with verapamil, and some have not. And to my knowledge, the jury is still out, and there's no real conclusive evidence that this is actually going to increase your risk of cancer. But it may be a possibility. I'm not sure. But nifedipine and diltiazem, I'm pretty confident in saying that they don't cause cancer. But regardless, the point still stands. It doesn't mean you can't show anything to be the case with a relative risk lower than 2 for a high disease prevalence population. All it means is that if you're going to have that case, if you're going to try to show that, you need a well-powered study. The other thing to point out here is that setting a number at 2 is arbitrary, and it's not shared by everyone in the field. So there are other statisticians, there are other epidemiologists that set these values differently. They would set 1.2 as no strength of association, and anything from 1.2 to 1.5 as a weak association, and they would set a strong association as a relative risk of greater than 1.5. And some even say decreased risk would be weighted differently. So all of these numbers are arbitrary. They're arbitrary cutoff points, but the main point I want to bring across is that these cutoff points need to be varied depending on the context of the prevalence of the disease. As the prevalence of the disease gets higher, a relative risk that is lower becomes more acceptable because it becomes less possible to have a higher relative risk in the first place. As the prevalence gets higher, a lower relative risk can still be more impactful.
Right? It's a food questionnaire. It's not reliable.
At some point in any discussion with an epidemiology denier, you're going to get into the validity of food frequency questionnaires. They'll always bring it up, and they'll always say it's completely invalid, it's completely useless, it's all over the place. So it's important to actually have data on this to show why that's actually not the case. So this is a very important study because it actually stratified patients who were mildly cognitively impaired. So presumably they would have a large amount of trouble with remembering the foods that they're eating, and compared that with the age-matched people who did not have mild cognitive impairment. And what they did was they gave them food frequency questionnaires, and they also drew their blood and measured biomarkers that would relate and potentially correlate with the foods they were actually eating to see if what they were telling you actually matched up with reality. And these were the results. Now, obviously, not every biomarker is actually going to do this because of absorption rates, but in the multivariate adjusted model that adjusted for the most confounding factors, you'll notice that the mild cognitively impaired group, nothing here except for one factor, except for magnesium, was statistically significant. And that was only statistically significant at the p is equal or less than 0.05 level. So none of these variables, none of these biomarkers were statistically significant except for one. For the most part, in the mildly cognitively impaired group, it was all over the place. But if you look at the patients who were not cognitively impaired, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of these biomarkers start to become statistically significant, not just at the 0.05 level, but at the 0.01 level. And the degree to which there's the effect size is actually not that bad. A 0.76 correlation or a 0.7 correlation is not a bad correlation coefficient. It's not that bad of a correlate. So it's not going to be the case that food frequency questionnaires are going to be distributed randomly with reality. They're not going to be all over the place. There's going to be a decent correlation with reality in non-cognitively impaired patients. And the other thing to note about this is just that you can't, if you're going to assert that there's errors or inaccuracies in food frequency questionnaires, when you have a large sample size, generally these things tend to cancel out. If you're going to make the case that the errors won't cancel out, even though there are large sample sizes in all groups, then that burden of proof is on you. Generally speaking, these things cancel out. Unless you want to make the case that they're completely random. As long as there's a decent correlation coefficient with reality, you can't speculate to say that, well, whatever is not correlating with reality will correlate in one direction for one large group in a way that it wouldn't with another large group, and it wouldn't cancel out. That is a speculation, and that is your burden of proof to bear if you want to make that case.
Do you understand what relative risk is?
Arguing against veganism can increase your relative risk of getting sick-stepped by more than 2.